Gabriella, where does this podcast find you?
Hi, Ben. I am in Lisbon, in Portugal, and it is just turning into springtime over here. So in a couple of hours, I'm looking forward to seeing the swallows come back and fly over these red rooftops behind me somewhere. And I'm enjoying this shift right now.
Beautiful. And for those of our listeners who don't know you or of you and the work that you do, could you please just give a quick intro of who you are, what you do, and what drives you?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm really aware that when I usually try to do this, it turns into a list and it's not very interesting to listen to or necessarily to share either. I wear many hats and I have a diverse range of ways that I show up in different places. So I'd rather share maybe a framing that relates to a little bit about my background. So something that I think you might know about me already, Ben, but others may not, is that I'm a trained actor. Part of my acting training or part of my learnings in that were helped me to be very resourceful. You know, stepping into character, you learn that in order to portray something in a convincing way or to be very real with an emotional resonance, you kind of have to access a library of experiences of your own and transform them into some new creative form through the character. And I think everything that I've done since then has been a bit like that. I arrive in a place. My mission is to first be present and listen, to sense what the need of the place might be, whether it's explicit or between the lines, and create an experience that serves that need in some way, shape, or form. And really, the list, if you read it with that frame, I think this is always what I've been doing, really.
By the time people will listen to this part of the conversation, they will have already gotten a quick intro from me. So I'll be sure to add some of the pieces or items on the list to that. But I do appreciate you sharing a little bit more of how you see yourself, and especially because part of what I am exploring with this podcast is what I call the future of humanistic business leadership. And I think traditional business leadership is also very much so rooted in putting people in boxes and prescribing certain characteristics through a list to who we are, the value we bring. And so I really appreciate you kind of stepping out of that intentionally, with and provoking maybe that thought and idea in people. The one thing I want to ask you about, though, because as I was preparing for our conversation and reading about your background, the one thing that stuck with me was you describe yourself as a human conservationist. So tell me more about, in the context of what we just heard in your intro, what that means to you and why you think that is something that is relevant and important in today's world.
Thank you. Well, I'd start by saying human conservationist is intended as quite a playful, tongue-in-cheek reference. I feel like when I named my consulting that and kind of indirectly myself this, I was pinning a shared feeling of the moment, some kind of sense of panic, or I learned a German word recently that has been rattling around in my head related to this, that is Torschlusspanik.
Yes.
Which is this, as I understand it, the closing of the panic that you experience when there's a closing of a gate in front of you and you really feel you must get underneath it.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. So I feel like we might be in a moment of collective Torschlusspanik on a lot of levels. And there's something about human conservationism that speaks to that. And while I'm not going to give stories of doom and gloom and necessarily be very negative about what might be endangered in us, there is something in that feeling that I think we ought to listen to and celebrate and make the most of. So it's really an invitation to be in spaces where we can hear ourselves feel that and ask the questions we'd like to ask and maybe put into practice what we'd like to see more of in the future of our humanity. Because everything we see is human made anyway, right? And that's a philosophical question for another time and maybe an anthropological one. And I could open that door too. But yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
It is interesting because there's two parts in what you mentioned that I think would be great to dive a little deeper into. The one part is leaning into that collective, at least for a certain group of people, collective sense of gates closing, or at least major things shifting that make us feel uneasy. And there's not yet maybe a judgment on if things change for the better or for the worse, but certainly they make us feel uneasy. And then you said, don't want to be doom and gloom, which I feel is often the immediate sort of judgment that is put on anyone who's even just voicing, hey, this doesn't necessarily feel good. It might not be going in the right direction. And there's an immediate sort of polarization and binarization that is happening, and you get stamped as doom and gloom. What does it make you think, or how do you feel about that?
There were two parts of this question, and I'd love you to remind me of the first part.
Yeah. Well, the first part was mostly just acknowledging that things do feel like they're shifting in big ways, and that makes us feel uneasy. So the question that comes out of that is that how do we deal with this in a way that it doesn't immediately stamp anyone who feels that way as a doom and gloomer, and rather how do we lean into that feeling and use it to make sure we're going in a better direction rather than something that might turn out for the worse?
Well, I'll start there. There are many scientists, experts in various fields that can tell a story that feels pretty final and concerning, and can give us a sense of Torschlusspanik, whether it's environmental or political or in terms of technology advancement and regulation and the impact on our lives in general and our societies and cultures. But if you probe anyone with a very strong conviction and a very strong opinion, and you keep following that, you eventually get to a place where they don't know. This is what at least in my experience, I'm very wary of anyone. Predictions are very helpful. Science is very helpful. Definitely take all of this very seriously. But ultimately, it's very hard for us to tell what the outcome will be in times that are unprecedented. And we don't have all the information, and we never have, and we never will. And so where I play my small part and is really in a perspective shift, or a way of sitting in the comfort of not knowing, or transferring the discomfort into a comfort of sitting with uncertainty and maybe being playful with it and being able to thrive despite it, and perhaps even enjoy it.
What forms does that take?
Well, I have a toolkit. I have a creative toolkit. I have a creative backpack of all the wonderful creative experiences I have had and practiced and been lucky enough to train in and enjoy since I was a child. Really, I grew up in a very creative family, participating in the arts from a very early age. And every single thing in that backpack can speak to what I just described. A lot of artists, not all, but a lot, speak of the creative process in a similar way, that it's really, you don't know what emerges until you are in it. And it's a sort of a blind trust or a comfort in the discomfort. And that it's an agency beyond yourself. And many call this a very spiritual experience. And really that speaks a lot to this kind of practice, this kind of getting comfortable with not knowing where things will go and not having to grasp onto certainties. There's an idea from John Keats, the poet, of negative capability, sitting with uncertainty without trying to grasp for answers too soon or at all. And that kind of thing we can practice through improvised art making. So just to be very specific about the kinds of things that I do, things that a lot of the surrealists love, like automatic writing, automatic drawing, improvisational poetry, movement, somatic exercises. I also bring a lot of improv theatre into what I do. There's a wonderful collective spirit in that creative process that I try to bring into any learning environment that I'm a part of. And I also draw from creative therapies because there's a lot of wisdom there that can be applied in these contexts with care, right? And this is a taster of what I put into play.
And it's a great summary of sorts why I wanted to speak with you, both from my own personal life and career story so far. I've benefited greatly from experiencing a lot of these versions of the creative process, from being a child growing up in basically my grandparents' bakery and being exposed to all sorts of acts of creation that build a sense of self, that build a sense of agency, all the way to then, going to art school and being more formally trained. Yet at the same time, then entering the tech world for me, was my kind of professional growing up essentially as an executive. You then encounter how pretty much all traditional business and leadership training is at very much to the other end of the spectrum of what you just described, which is probably why then a lot of people end up having some form of moment where some of their beliefs or parts of their life break down, and they have to try and rekindle some of their spirit, some of their motivation, and even maybe their own purpose in life through going back to what you just described. What do you find is broken in the way maybe we're educating people, or what is the reason why we've built a whole world that trains out what you just described out of the children that are all born creative, all curious, all in their body, much more connected to themselves and to others? So I know that you're working with a lot of business leaders, with groups of leaders, and I would love to get your take on that, because you're sort of the person trying to unwind a lot of that with them.
Yes, and I wouldn't have put it any better myself. And I think a lot of what I do is an unlearning, it's an unwinding. And the words you just used, the professional growing up, made my heart a little sad because it really spoke to, at some point, getting serious and growing up, and this idea that there's no space for the wiggliness anymore, as singer Jacob Collier likes to put it. This feeling that, and it starts in our education systems, as you pointed to, this feeling that there is a specific way of being that's more serious or more sophisticated, and anything that might be childlike in us is not serious and should not be taken seriously. And unfortunately, that leaves behind all the wisdom that is innately ours and our right to pay attention to. And more than that, it's our sense of self, or the closest that I think we would ever have to a sense of self, comes through that kind of play. So yes, I think there are a lot of systems that are very rigid, and where I come in, I hope I provide some kind of breath of fresh air and access back to a time where there was more of an essence of who you might be and what might be most relevant to us and what we might need to be expressing. And play for the sake of play is also wonderful. And I celebrate that, and I bring that in many cases as well.
I've had a few conversations over the short history of this podcast so far where this same notion and theme has come up in different nuances and different colors. And I can't help but think that certainly a lot of this has to do also with our understanding of value creation in the way the Industrial Revolution has defined it. And maybe part of this big shift that we're sensing and that is happening certainly is putting all of that very much in question. And where I'm trying to go with this is you talked about certainty earlier at the very beginning, and this idea of certainty, predictability, right? And our entire education system, our definition of work and how value is created is all based on something that's very predictable, repeatable, manageable, measurable. And so the issue with all of that is that it is very removed from how we are born and how we relate to each other. And at the same time, it also allows us to not have to deal with the messiness that is the human experience. I think a reason why a lot of people are holding on to, this is the right way of being, right? And this is the way we can measure if we're being good or not. How do we reconcile this? Because that's where we are currently in the way typically we train all the way young people to grown professional adults, is removing us from that messiness. And that feels good maybe in the moment, but it's also, as one of my guests who also introduced us, Joao Silviano, said, it makes us sick, actually, physically in a lot of ways, mentally, emotionally, and collectively as well. So what do you think are ways to reconcile it? How do you find this in your own work? Do people, once they feel the difference, stay in it? How it's pulling them back? How do we move and lead people into a more connected future?
Going back a little bit to your Industrial Revolution reference, I'm finding it really interesting that, since then we've been trying to compare ourselves to the machines we made, right? And kind of let them hold the standard for humans in some interesting ways. And we never quite got to be that machine. And now it feels to me that with AI, we are building a version of ourselves that we were never able to achieve with those measures, which is coming in very interesting ways. We respond to it in interesting ways. We worship it because it was the thing we were never able to eat. We made it superhuman. We made it like us. There's a lot of reasons behind that, of course, and that you'll know better than I do, I'm sure. It's interesting that we can think of that as an opportunity to ask the questions that we're asking. And I understand this is the premise of this podcast as well, and your explorations. What's left for us? Can we reclaim our human agency a little bit away from the machines? And this is also very closely related to my work with the House of Beautiful Business. I understand Tim Lebrecht was also a guest on this podcast, so I won't stay with that a lot, but his work has influenced mine and vice versa. So yes, I just think this is a very interesting thing to remember, or perspective, and just first thinking about it in that way helps, and understanding that actually the hardest work is the most personal work often. The hardest work is stepping into the discomfort of the human experience and the very essential things that we all share and always have shared as humans. I don't drop those existential bombs in any of my sessions, but they are a little bit more present when we have moments of shared humanity that kind of, for a little period of time, soften some of these masks and habits and hats and alls. This is the way that I find that if we keep practicing this over time, people, especially in community, especially if this is a collective, a group experience, I tend to prefer working with quite intimate groups of maybe 6 to 8 people or 10 to 12 maximum over a long period of time. And you actually see quite an organic shift that's not so shocking. And it can become very comfortable through looking at a few of the harder things together. And again, this makes me sound a lot more therapeutic than I am. I don't approach it from this vocation, but it can have also some effects in that regard.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the beliefs that I hold, and it has formed over time leading others, is that we're only able to lead others to the extent that we can lead ourselves. And another foundational belief is that a business, an organization, is fundamentally not here to serve itself. And that might be controversial, because that is certainly how at least the late stage capitalism is acting up. But it has a social responsibility, which requires, both of those things require leaders to connect with themselves and then in turn with each other. So I was interested in hearing more about what you find in your work. If that happens, which it seems like it does, like there is more of a connection happening. Because I also do believe that ultimately we're born much more connected to ourselves and to others. So I do feel it does resonate with people on a very kind of instinctual level. But our mind is very powerful and can convince us that is just all woo-woo and we don't need that, right? Because it doesn't add any shareholder value long term. So it is encouraging to hear that maybe it's not therapy or therapeutic, but it is certainly having an effect. What do you see in terms of what has the biggest effect? Because I know you mentioned at the beginning and also my research that you do a lot of improv work, and that struck a chord for me personally, because I've greatly benefited from in my youth and then later in life from exposing myself and doing improv myself. Is that one of the modalities that you think is the most effective? What are ways in which, because I also want to hopefully deliver a little bit of inspiration for people that are listening to just try some things out, because it can be very scary when all your life you've been going in a certain direction and suddenly, there's two people like us saying, hey, look, there's a whole part that you're missing, but where do you start? What are the things that are really effective for those that are curious enough to try out things?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Improv is a great place to start. Improv theater, improv groups, practices. It's one of the core things that I bring into my work. I also teach improv courses locally in Lisbon as well, to a small community here. And there's something about it that really speaks to all of these things that business isn't, but might be, that we might want it to be. It's a very safe playground and practice ground, rehearsal ground for life. There is an improv teacher that I admire and respect a great deal in Berlin called Chris Hyman, who taught for several years at the Royal Academy in London, improvisation. And he calls it a gym for the heart. And that's something that I always appreciated and agreed with, because it invites you to completely free yourself from self-consciousness, perfectionism, overthinking, the desire to achieve anything extraordinary. Actually, one of the most valuable lessons in improv is to be as ordinary as possible. You very quickly learn that the more funny you want to be, the more interesting you want to be, the more planned you want to be, the least you will do for the good of the scene or the group in that moment. And you won't be present, you won't be relevant, and you won't be actually adding structure that's necessary for the moment. So I think it's a really, really good learning from practicing improv theater, and also accepting that there is, like the library I was referring to at the beginning, you have everything you need already. And you don't, in improv, create something from nothing. You create something from everything you've ever experienced, sensed, felt, read, listened to. It's there. Whether you know how it comes to you is irrelevant. Actually, just practicing getting the answer from yourself in an organic way, or something coming from you in an organic way, is a very important exercise in an age of externalizing answers, in an age of the LLM being our oracle or our source of conviction, certainty, answers. It almost depletes our trust in ourselves to have wisdom and knowledge and material that is really more than good enough, if not good enough, which is also fine.
Yeah. This brings up a few things that I think is really relevant for the conversation that we're having. Starting with confidence, I personally also experienced that that's something that improv builds. It's the same as actually, my personal creative practice, and I see this with a lot of friends, former colleagues that have a creative practice. It builds that resourcefulness, so a healthy confidence that you can figure it out. And I think that's really powerful. The other part that I always found really interesting with improv is that really it takes away any competitiveness that could potentially ruin a group dynamic. It really brings out the best in everyone that's there, because you're constantly just building on the others. And that is very far from typically the experience that you have even in the best work environments, professional environments. There is always an element of competitiveness, which we know actually there's a lot of neuroscience now that over the last 5-10 years that's come out that proves that energy and that setup of an improv group, that playfulness, actually does in fact bring out our best ideas, brings out our best outcomes of a collaboration. So I find that really fascinating. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on, which is probably a good kind of segue into a question I had for you, is that it entirely changes, I would say, the self-understanding of what a leader is and does in a group. On the one hand, creating hopefully the condition that enables that kind of improvisation, which I often compare that we actually need to move away from the idea of a professional organization being an orchestra with a conductor and more to it being like a jazz band where you create conditions and then everyone gets to play the instrument in the best way that they can contribute to a shared performance. So you work with a lot of leaders. How do you think leadership in this way needs to change? What is one of the things that's fundamentally broken with the traditional understanding of leadership? And how do you think, from your perspective, leadership in the future needs to look like to enable us to deal with everything from AI to a world that is in disarray? And it seems like reconfiguration will take decades, not months. So what's your take on that?
I think leaders being fine with looking a bit silly or not knowing is a
I
great
love
place
that.
to start. Honestly, gosh, knowing that it's okay not to have all the answers and challenging the pressure that a lot of leaders have on themselves to know everything. We are in, as I said some moments ago, we're in a time when no one really knows what's coming and how things are going to unfold with any certainty, to use that word again. And so any leader that claims to know the answer actually looks more ridiculous than a leader that says, I don't know, let's sit together and talk about it. And I love your idea of the jazz band dynamic, because a good leader will know how to throw something into, a bit like a good facilitator or a good teacher, throw something into a room that can be played with and picked up by someone else, that understands the different parts of the group and the different roles different people have to play. And it's important that this team is diverse in terms of personality types and ways of operating and seeing and being. And the leader is just one ingredient in that, and is just an embodiment of acting, moving forward with what we've got so far, and being, of course, on the pulse and, of course, with the latest information, but also being very human about it and being comfortable enough to admit when the knowledge isn't there, or when maybe not the knowledge, but the prediction of the future, the oracle. The leader is not oracle either. So I think this is something that is our biggest current learning point from what I can see.
Yeah. And it is interesting how, in curating the conversations that I get to have on the podcast and learning from the guests, it is really interesting how I find that when we want to offer alternatives or a glimpse into the future of leadership, it is easy to try and be prescriptive about the next set of skills, to give certainty as to these set of skills work so far, but the new set of skills are these 5 things on the list that you need to practice. But not only hearing you speak right now, but also some of the other conversations I've had a chance to have, it is really interesting that the answer seems to more and more circle around, we need to learn, first and foremost, to be in our own messy humanness. And if anything, build our creative self-efficacy, our ability to be creative, to figure things out, but also to trust in maybe the things that we don't consciously know and the things that come out of a creative, collaborative process that are not yet defined, that is really actually this quote-unquote skill, because it's hard to even put it into a word or a few words. Does that feel right?
Yes, that feels like my approach. Suddenly, it feels very right to me. I don't want to prescribe, and I know it's the most satisfying thing also on a podcast to come away with a list of action points or notes to write down. I'm afraid I'm not that kind of guest, and
this is not this kind of podcast either, so that's good.
Right. This is what I was sensing, and that's the point. There's a quote that I really love from Fernando Pessoa, the Portuguese writer, whose book, The Book of Disquiet, was the first book I read when I arrived in Portugal 10 years ago. And there's a really lovely quote there about opinion that I live by quite fiercely, or as fiercely as I can. To hold an opinion is the best proof of the inability to have one.
I love that. That is a wonderful quote and a great reminder. I want to talk about with you, you wrote something on LinkedIn around learning through the body. And when I go back through what we discussed so far, I think a part of the answer we're looking for in that, because you said something earlier about how we need to be able to I guess, be in this uncertainty. And I think from listening to you that we need to learn to actively, physiologically sit in that discomfort of uncertainty. So when you talk about learning through the body, we will link to your LinkedIn piece in the show notes. What are ways to learn through the body that allows us or enables us to maybe sit more in that discomfort? And, I think I'm paraphrasing you, but also to potentially slow down because we don't have the answer, and the answer might unfold, but we need to be able, first and foremost, to just be in that discomfort. So how do we learn through the body, and what are the things that we can do to learn through the body so that we maybe can be more in that discomfort?
Yeah, so what I call embodied learning is what you're touching upon here. It's essentially another way to get back to this early way that we learn as children. Again, we are all naturally, intrinsically kinesthetic learners, among other types of learning. And the body is often left out of the room, certainly in leadership development programs and those kinds of environments. And there are ways in which we can incorporate the body that help us first. And some environments, this is all that's needed. Remember that we have one and that the people around us also have one. Again, it's this shared sense of our humanity, and having a body is probably the most boring and interesting part of being a human. And it's one that obviously gets missed, but also the body as a source of information. And by that, I don't mean the body as the answer to all the questions we have, because just like the mind doesn't have all of those, the body certainly doesn't either. But what we carry with us is a certain pattern, a result of many years and generations of patterns and experiences and yes, traumas. And there are people that do a lot of important work somatically with that. And so that's one side of it that I think is really important, that we carry our bodies with us, and our bodies have information that is worth us acknowledging when we can. And then there's another part, which is the process of learning. It involves having some sort of repetition, association, novelty, and emotional resonance. And a lot of those things you can actually find through somatic exercises, a lot of improvisational somatic exercises that actually really help the content or the skills or the kinds of things that you're trying to learn and practice really land in a physical way. And so I experiment with that, and I don't have a methodology fully formed or framework to share, but there are different ways in which we can work with the body in that regard. And what I find is often it kind of cuts through to the essential of what the resonant information really might be for us, and that tends to be what sticks longer term.
That is in itself a really good reminder, because even as simple as going for a walk, it brings you and can bring you back into the body. The science is very much so on the side of it being true, because walking meetings are producing better outcomes than sitting in a chair in an office cubicle or staring at a screen. So it doesn't have to be complicated, right? And the way the ancient practice of yoga has developed, and there's other modalities in especially Asian culture, that it is in fact not complicated, but it is important that there is a practice that brings you back into the body so that you can access all of that wisdom. Do you typically find you have to jump over that emotional and rational hurdle of people especially the professional context, discounting this kind of work as woo-woo and stuff that, is maybe relevant for other people, but certainly not for them? Or do you recognize that there's a more of an openness that's happening?
So I think I'm lucky enough to be invited into rooms where there's already openness. If I'm being honest, I don't tend to be flown into a situation that's very completely closed. I am lucky that I have usually got somebody who's inviting me that has some level of respect within the groups that I'm working with. And an openness to these kinds of ways of learning and operating. And as you were saying in your earlier comment about starting simple, being able to read the room and understand that sometimes a walk is the practice, is the somatic practice that you will bring. I'm a big believer in really sensing into where the readiness is in the room. Pushing, yes, but pushing playfully and gently towards more creative ways of doing and being. But I haven't yet been in a situation where I've been completely blocked, and I count myself as lucky, and I almost hope for one of those quite soon, because I think that will tell a lot.
You've mentioned a few times playfulness, and I would love to hear more about that and how you cultivate it and pull it out of people, because I have a sense that the way I understand playfulness, there's an element of opening up an emotional door that people actually want to do it. That is a way to get to change and growth. But how do you understand playfulness, and what are ways that you can cultivate it in people and groups of people? And is it true that is my sense of it maybe facilitating the change we want to see in a way that people follow it maybe more?
Yes, I'm at risk of repeating myself a little bit here, but if you'll humor me and bear with me, a lot of what I try to or the entry point to playfulness is often bringing things from the past, bringing very analog things into a space, like crayons, like big sheets of paper and a lot of different colors. I'm going towards my art materials in this answer, but I almost host an adult kindergarten and see what happens and encourage people to kind of hark back to this childlike wonder and awe and exploration. And what we do with our hands, or what we used to do with our hands when we were children, has got lost with our technologies and the way that a lot of us are working now. I'll mention, there are a lot of educational methods that are really interesting, like the Montessori school, for example, for children, that are really interesting in this regard. There's Maria Montessori said that the hands are the instrument of man's intelligence. And so, there she was making a reference to the fact that if we engage our hands in a way with materials, and we build and we create and we explore in a very tactile way, that's a way that we used to learn and to play. And that's a very accessible thing for most of us, because we've been in those environments. And I'm talking small child kindergarten, not the art class, not the, when things get
which is the most formative part of our brain development, right?
Indeed. Exactly.
Yeah. It is also interesting because it reminds me of some research. This is over a decade ago. We did at Microsoft around how important the use of a physical pencil or pen is, even in a digital context, to retain knowledge. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to ask is, in this context, as I'm personally trying to make sense of the world as it is today and with all its complexity, I've gone back to painting a lot more again. And one of the biggest struggles has actually been removing judgment from the creative process, which, as a trained professional creative, it's actually quite hard. How do you find that in the workshops and the work you're doing? Is that a big hurdle, that when we first try to get back into that very childlike playfulness, especially in the professional context still, that you need to overcome? And how do you do that?
Entire focus on the process and nothing at all on the result. Just that is one of the first things I say. The point is not what's left at the end. It's the process. It's the experience. Again, coming back to experience. It's the experience of creating. That is the important thing to be a part of. The result and this judgment, it shouldn't be present in these kinds of contexts. That's not the point.
It's in itself a really challenging part of the process, which I think, going back to one of our earlier parts of the conversation, is a very important skill to learn in itself, right? That is you actively dealing with uncertainty and the discomfort that comes with that. So to wrap us up, I have one question that I always ask my guests at the end, because I work with students a lot in my teaching work. And I have a lot of optimism and hope because it's a very smart, I find often much more connected generation of young people. If there's one piece of advice that you could and would like to share with these young people that we send out into the world to help us build the future, what would that be?
Don't be afraid to be ordinary.
That's a great way for us to wrap the conversation. So thank you so much for coming on the show. And I feel inspired and I'm very grateful we got to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's been a pleasure.
And that's a wrap for this week's show. Thank you for listening to Poets and Thinkers. If you like this episode, make sure you hit follow and subscribe to get the latest episodes wherever you listen to your podcast.